Hope you all had a nice break, nice chance to catch up. So our next session is going to look at innovation in humanitarian food delivery. And we have a really exciting mix of panelists all joining us here in person in Austin. Really excited to introduce them. So first, I want to welcome Anwar to the stage. Thank you, Anwar. Anwar Khan is the president and co-founder of Islamic Relief USA. Next, I'd love to welcome, I want to make sure she's nearby, I think so, Adesuwa. There you are. Adesuwa Ifedi, she's the Africa Senior Vice President at Heifer International, which we've heard a bit about today, and soon you will learn more. Next, we have Kirk Prichard. He's the Vice President of Programs at Concern Worldwide. Welcome, Kirk. And finally, Maria Kasparian, who's the Executive Director of Edesia. Thank you all so much for joining us. Let's give them a round of applause. So you all come at this big topic of innovating humanitarian food delivery from 4 very different perspectives, and I'm really excited to bring them together in this conversation. So quickly, just so we get a sense of each of your organizations and what you're doing on this big topic, let's just hear what is an example of a way that you are bringing innovation to humanitarian food delivery. And we'll start with you, Anwar.
First of all, thank you for allowing me to be here and with my amazing colleagues. Often faith voices and minority voices aren't included. Thank you, Devex, for including us. So just wanted to really appreciate that, number one. And thank you for allowing us to be at this cool place of South by Southwest. So moving on, one of the things that we do is we were working with a university in southern Pakistan, in Sindh, to help to make sure that we were providing flood-resistant seeds and helping them with the latest technology, which included laser-guided tractors that would level the ground to get the best water retention in that area. So we're taking the ideas from other places and implementing these in places where people often don't read and write. They're right at the bottom of the social classes, and we're implementing these cutting-edge technologies in places where there's no electricity and there's no political support. So that's one example.
Thank you, Anwar. We'll hear more soon. Adesuwa, what about you? What does innovation in humanitarian food delivery look like for Heifer?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for inviting us. I'm happy to be here. I don't know how many of you know that Heifer started over 75 years ago, and we started as a humanitarian organization, working in Europe, then working in Asia, South Korea particularly, and then also working in different parts of the world. Well, our journey has been an interesting one, where we began by providing livestock. We had the seagoing cowboys who provided livestock to war-torn victims in war-torn countries. Over the years, I think our organization began to reflect on the sustainability and also the life and dignity of these people who we were supporting, and realized that they don't need milk, what they need is a cow. And that's where our history of passing on the gift started from, with the understanding that people have the capacity to pull themselves out of poverty, but will need enabling environment, and wanted to be able to look at humanitarian as great point to start with, but the immediate connection to development, sustainability, resilience as critical. And so for us at Heifer, we've evolved over time, and we're very, very passionate about the evolution of the food systems to drive that resilience and to ensure we address issues of hunger. Today, we have 1/3 of all the people who are suffering from droughts in Africa today. And out of the 800 million people who are hungry in the world today, 1/4 of that is in Africa. So the food systems are critical, and that's why we believe in driving local food systems, building local food systems as a way of driving sustainability. And how do we see scaling local food systems that have seen the least investment and have seen the least interest in developing them? These are ways in which local communities can be food resistant. And so working with innovators like Hello Tractors for us has helped us, because what we're really trying to do is to ask ourselves, what is the ecosystem needed to build these local food systems, and where does innovation and technology come in to make that happen?
And we'll hear more about how your support of ag tech is actually connected, if indirectly perhaps, with this bigger question of humanitarian food delivery. Kirk, what is innovation around this big topic, especially as we're confronting so many crises as we've heard about today? COVID, conflict, climate, what does this look like for Concern?
Yeah, just choosing one that I particularly find interesting. It's about getting ahead of the curve So it's around modeling and early warning forecasts and all these things. We have all these data points, like people were talking about earlier, market prices, weather patterns, all these things, even the migration of livestock and whatnot, that we can look at and then predict where the next food security or nutrition problem is going to be. So we have a big program in the Sahel around that, some of these other things, looking at getting ahead of the problem so that we can prevent a malnutrition problem or a hunger problem from happening in the first place.
Absolutely. And Maria, I'm glad to have you here as well. And I know Edesia, for those who are less familiar, and you can share more, is focused on nutrition and malnutrition, which of course is a big part of the conversation today. So what does innovation in this space look like for you?
Sure. Well, I'm curious from our audience, how many of you are familiar with Plumpy Nut, or RUTF, by a show of hands? All right. So this product itself, plus the programs through which it's distributed, was a major innovation. It was developed originally in the late 90s and then really piloted by groups like Concern and others, and proved out for the first time that this product, which is made of peanuts and soy and oils and dairy and vitamins and minerals, and is ready to eat, could be used for home-based care of acute malnutrition, severe acute malnutrition. So children who are on the edge of starvation, who are deeply malnourished and need a medical rehabilitative care, a ready-to-use product with a community-based management program was able to cure kids and is able to cure kids at a 95% cure rate, as opposed to hospitalizations and other types of products, programs and products that happened before then. So what does innovation mean today? That really rolled out since about 2005. There are now 22 producers of these foods globally. There are countless NGOs and governments that have integrated ready-to-use foods, RUTF, into their health systems. But we've got to look at things like new formulations, using more local ingredients, especially for factories that are making these products in Africa, Asia, Latin America. It also means partnering on better distribution models, not just keeping the same method, but evolving it. And also focusing on more prevention and focusing on more of the supply chains to improve access. So I'll talk more later.
I want to ask, this is a bit of a curveball, sorry everybody, but when you hold up Plumpy Nut, it leads me to this question. I feel like there's a bit of a debate around, are the solutions out there, it's just we need to get them to people, or do we need more solutions? Plumpy Nut, as an example, the product is there, but there are so many other issues around getting it to people and how we get it to people. Just quick survey of our panel here. Do you feel like the solutions are there, we just need to get them to people, or we need to work on the solutions as well? Thoughts, quickly? Both?
I think the solution's out there.
You think they're there, okay. It's about getting them to people.
95% of the solutions are there.
Okay.
I think it's often more about the political will than the solutions. So I mean, to use RUTF as an example, because of funding and will, historically we reach about 25% of kids who are starving each year. Last year, USAID stepped up and posted another $200 million to UNICEF. This year, we'll reach 50% of those kids.
Wow.
The scale, both for the products and the programs, that was able to scale once the resources were there.
But another 50% to go as well.
Another 50% to go.
Adesuwa, do you want to respond?
Yes, and I want to say that for us, why we say the solutions are there, as a development organization, we are evolving. Our first stage was focusing on passing on the gift of animals. Right now, we're seeing the importance of passing on the gift, which is about financing, about supporting and strengthening ecosystems, and about being innovative, not just in product, but in ways of partnering. So, for example, why not identify partners like this organization here, as well as many other organizations, Hello Tractors, and build an ecosystem? I think what we need to innovate is the way we work together and the way we see all of our various investments coming to solve the solution.
I want to ask another question related to innovation. So, Anwar, when people hear Islamic relief, they might think relief in the traditional sense, right? Like emergency food distribution, for example. But, you've mentioned to me that Islamic relief, yes, does that work, but also does some of the development work that Adesuwa just referenced. So can you tell us more about that? I know you work on both of these fronts, and
Thank you.
What do people not understand, basically?
Okay, so there's three main fronts we work on: advocacy, sustainability, humanitarian work. Normally, when I introduce Islamic relief to people, I have to explain what it means really quickly. Islamic, because we're inspired by our faith, but we employ people of all faith and no faith. We help people of all faith and no faith. Relief, because we started doing relief, but we also do development and advocacy. USA, because we're proud to be from the USA, but we work in 40 countries around the world through our direct partners and many more countries through other partners. That's very simply what it is. we have access right now in Afghanistan that most of the INGOs do not. We have access in places where others do not. So we love our brothers and sisters from other faiths and secular organizations. We regard ourselves as an important part of that ecosystem. We have cultural sensitivity in some areas where others don't. If we want to work in South America, my go-to is Catholic Relief Services, because they have cultural sensitivity that we don't have, and vice versa. Recently, we're working with Kasparian Relief Development against gender-based violence in West Africa. They're supporting us in Turkey earthquake. Same with Heifer, Hebrew Immigration Aid Service. So many times people think religion is the problem. Well, it is sometimes, but it can also be the solution. So we need to work together with the best of science. And the reason why I said both is I have a biochemistry background. I think there's still a lot of ideas out there we haven't touched. So I'm thinking more about the future.
Fair, fair. And just to narrow in on faith and the role of faith in particular, like you said, often that's the most effective way to reach these communities is because that connection through faith. So how do you then connect that with innovation? I mean, to me, it seems pretty obvious, like innovation is nothing if you don't have relationships with communities. Is that what you would say to it, or how would you expand on
that? That was the example I gave about in Sindh with the flood resistant. The local university, we connected them with this impoverished community. They said, this is based on the soil samples, these are the seeds that you need. Based on the area, this is the kind of fish that you want to have in your fish farm. They would never have access to that. The laser technology, they don't know what laser technology is. And even if they did, they couldn't afford it. So it's important for us to bring in that technology. And also, sometimes we talk about decolonization. They trust us, where they may not trust others. And it's not like the guys from the north are coming to the rescue. We try to have cultural sensitivity with local people, and that's where the faith comes in. And we see no problem between science and faith.
Love that, thank you. Adesuwa, you mentioned your support of Hello Tractor, which also came up earlier. Can you tell us more about why is Heifer leaning into this ag tech space? And not just through your own work, but actually support of other ag tech innovators out there? And how would you connect that to innovation in humanitarian food delivery?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, when you look at Africa, it's really heartbreaking when you talk about food security and how far we are from getting anywhere close to that. We have the world's largest arable land in the continent and yet spend $40 billion on food importation into that same continent every year. Whereas our agricultural sector can produce and deliver, if supported, way much more than what it is that we're importing. And then when we talk about hunger, we talked about the fact that 1/3 of the world's people that are hungry today and in Africa as a continent with the world's largest arable land. So what can we do to drive local food systems? What can we do to ensure that, like you rightly said, those of us who are on the ground and on the ground in Africa and understand its context can become the drivers of this new innovation and ways of working? The best way to do that is to leapfrog with technology. And whilst we know that the farmers are there, they understand what they need, and they do know what their challenges are, they also need local innovators or innovators who understand the landscape to get the work done. We know who we are in Heifer, and we understand where our work comes in, but we also know that the tech innovators will probably be the future of how development scales. So we are ready to quickly work with them. Aside from Hello Tractors we've talked about today, I was glad to hear you talk about climate-smart information to farmers, building farmer resilience against climate issues. Africa is suffering from a huge situation. I just used drought as an example, where 1/3 of the world's drought is in the continent. So addressing climate-smart information is key. Supporting farmers to have farming insurance. You'll be amazed why farmers can't get insurance in Africa, because no one can price insurance effectively in a way that is affordable to farmers. So we work with innovators who are using new ways of analyzing risk and then using big data to reduce that cost of insurance to farmers so that the poorest who actually need to be insured can get insured. So yes, we think innovators can leapfrog, and they are critical for us to get to the scale we need to get to in Africa.
And just a quick follow-up question for you, because we touched on this a little bit earlier in our conversation with Jahil Oliver from Hello Tractor, but I do think it's an important story to narrow in on. In your support of Hello Tractor, as Jahil mentioned, Heifer International was able to be really catalytic, which is a term you hear a lot, but this is a true example of it, where John Deere then came in as a commercial investor, not philanthropically supporting Hello Tractor. What would you point to as the lesson from that? Basically, how is Heifer ensuring that it's not just one-offs, like small grants to support these ag tech innovators and then good luck to you, But how do you ensure that that really is catalytic?
Yeah, we have to have our eye on the big picture, and the big picture is systemic transformation. And for systemic transformation to happen, we have to consider where the bottlenecks are, and it takes access to finance to unlock that. And I was listening to some of the panelists, and I was excited that as we move towards relief, Heifer started with passing on the gift with cows. Now we're doing 2.0, which is about financing, because we think financing and grants have to behave differently. So what did we do? We invested in those areas where we knew was critical for tractorization for Africa, but nobody else would take the risk to invest in it. So we brought in what we call the pay-as-you-go tractor ownership model, which allowed Hello Tractors to have tractor owners closest to the farmers who do not have credit records and cannot be ranked by a financial institution or be loaned to. So that innovation triggered the ability for them to test out that model and then be able to attract further capital. And as we work with partners, we are working with them to identify where those bottlenecks are, and we are thinking in a systemic way as we try to drive those changes.
Thank you. I want to bring up a topic that often comes up when we talk about innovations in humanitarian food assistance, or really any kind of humanitarian response, and that is cash. You know, cash is coming up as really a benchmark for the sector where, you know, organizations maybe should be asking why not cash, and demonstrate why their interventions are in fact needed when cash is shown to be so effective in so many cases. So Kirk, I know this is something you're looking at. What does this look like at Concern, and how does cash connect with this conversation on humanitarian food assistance?
Yeah, cash is huge, and it's ballooned massively over the last 10 years or so. I think it's something like 30% of all humanitarian funding now is coming through cash, which is great because it gives people the opportunity to buy what they want, what they don't want, what they need, etc. I always use the example, my son hates oatmeal. Like if you put oatmeal in front of him, he will literally throw it at you. You know, what if you're getting a distribution and someone gives you oatmeal? You know, you're out of luck there. But there's a couple things. One is it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. The problem is people sometimes think you can just throw cash at a problem and it solves it. You need to really contextualize it. I mean, Turkey's a perfect example. Earthquake just happened about a month ago, one of the biggest earthquakes there. Concern's obviously responding, and we are responding via essentially cash, basically like supermarket gift cards, you know, like that you would use here. But then there's also communities where the supermarkets aren't back up and running, or they aren't functional, or the roads are out, or something like that. And then we're literally taking ATVs of food up the mountain. You know, you need both and.
Yeah.
And it translates across the kind of humanitarian landscape. But my question for you guys here is, so who here thinks that cash can solve nutrition problems? Yeah, show of hands. Who thinks they can and who thinks it can't?
No hands for those tuning in online.
Hands? You know, giving a family cash, do you think it would solve the problems of malnutrition, children being undernourished? One?
Oh wait,
We got
were there
one
hands?
hand up here? Okay, yeah.
Okay, there
Couple
are
in the
some
back
hands.
there.
Okay,
So
they
who
were
thinks it
tentative
doesn't?
before.
No, agency? Yeah. Well, it was kind of a trick question because honestly, we don't know. So that's the thing, is like, everyone thinks it's the silver bullet. Like, oh, just give a family cash, it'll solve malnutrition. Or give a family cash, it'll solve agriculture problems. And you don't really know the answer to that yet. And we don't have those studies and things that back that up. There's some evidence out of Yemen that it reduces stunting. There's some evidence out of other places that it doesn't. There's some evidence that it does a little bit. But it really is about incorporating into a holistic program where it includes community mobilization, it includes agriculture, it includes all these other areas, early warning systems, protection, all these things that we can put together to make a better, more effective, more accountable humanitarian response.
I want to bring Maria in a moment because, of course, that question Kirk posed is directly related to Adesia and your work. But a follow-up question for you, Kirk. You know, cash itself really was an innovation in this space, but cash also relies on a number of innovations, particularly in some of the contexts you talked about when it comes to identifying people, for example. So can you speak to that a little bit more? Like, what are the innovations in this space that allow cash to be a growing focus for humanitarian food assistance, and what more is needed?
Yeah, well, the number one is mobile money. So, I mean, and this was, I mean, one of the first cash responses we did this was over 10 years ago in parts of Kenya and Malawi, which is essentially just using a SIM card, you know, way ahead of us here in America and other parts in terms of mobile money. It's so cheap, it's so fast, it's so effective, it's much safer, you know, you can do all these things. You're going to get a little controversial when you start talking about biometrics, some of these things like this. If you want to get really kind of into the weeds, you can talk about the blockchain and setting up registers along these lines that people smarter than I can talk a lot more, you know, in depth about.
My inbox is filled with pitches along these lines, yeah.
We had a running joke that whenever there was a problem, that concern that we couldn't solve, we'd be like, the blockchain will take care of that. Don't worry about it. That's the blockchain for you. So there are lots of things going on. And I think they're really effective. And I think one of the best things is bringing down the cost of it and bringing down some of these barriers to entry and allowing people to access this. But again, there is always a human component to it that needs to be followed up.
Thank you for that. So Maria, first, I could see you wanted to answer that question aloud when Kirk posed it, so maybe you can expand on that. And then actually go ahead and do that, and then I'll ask you a bit more.
Yeah, well, I think cash is part of the solution, and it really depends on the context, right? Of course, having more cash to be able to buy more nutritious foods is really helpful to decreasing malnutrition. However, there are circumstances where there's not access to enough. When I say nutritious field, it's proteins, fats, vitamins, minerals, not just staple crops, right? Growing bodies and brains. So the first 1,000 days of life, we talk about conception to 2 years of age, you need some real good macro and micronutrients during that time. And the healthier, the better nourished you are during that time, you're going to be healthier the rest of your life. But the opposite is also true. So there are times, we have still 3 million kids under age 5 dying every year because of malnutrition, starving. In 2023, when we saw 40% of food waste in the US, there is enough food. It's not because of not enough food, it's because of not enough access. So when we have a situation like that where we've got children starving, sometimes we can't wait for cash, like there's an emergency. So something like an RUTF with the community-based programs, that helps solve the immediate need. Those kids can survive. At the same time, that's not the long-term solution. So you want to build systems. So we have partner suppliers in Ethiopia, Nigeria, Madagascar, Sudan, India, Haiti, to name a few. They are manufacturing ready-to-use foods in their countries using as many local ingredients as possible. And part of the innovation is also to improve that, right? These are historically peanut, dairy-based fortified foods. In Africa, we're talking about alternate formulations that use millet. Millet was mentioned earlier, that use sorghum. In Asia, that use chickpea and lentils. In the U.S., we're looking at adding more soy because we can do it here in the U.S. more cost-effectively with some soy protein. So it's really context-specific. So we're doing two things. We're improving the cost-effectiveness and the local accessibility, local use of foods like RUTF, but then also saying, all right, we don't want to be making RUTF. If we're making RUTF, we've already waited too long. Kids are already too malnourished. We want to back that up. Think of the 1,000 days. Make sure a mother has a supplement she needs and the young child has a supplement they need so that they hopefully never need RUTF in the future. So, there are a lot of solutions. We make lipid-based nutrient supplements, which are small quantity, which are more like a daily vitamin in an oil peanut paste. There are other solutions too. Balanced food and nutrition is the #1 best solution. When that's not available, you can supplement with things like these lipid-based supplements, sprinkles, vitamins, corn soy blend, whatever, it depends on the context.
I want to ask you a big question that I know is hard to answer in just a few minutes, but part of why I wanted Adesia represented on this panel is I actually heard the founder of Adesia speak at an event a little while back, and she mentioned very boldly on stage, malnutrition is a solvable problem. And I know you agree with that. So tell us why. And kind of back to that question I posed earlier, like, are the solutions out there or do we need more solutions? If it's a solvable problem, big question I know, but why is it still such a problem? Why haven't we solved it? I know it's not all on your shoulders.
No, it is a solvable problem. It is not a disease to which we don't know the cure, right? If we're looking at severe acute malnutrition, the worst form, even then we have a cure. We have RUTF and a program. We don't have enough will, as we talked about earlier. The will and the funding needs to be there. And then we have to back up to talk about the prevention. I think the way to solve it is first to have sustained impact. We're seeing what an extra budget is helping this year. We're seeing that's huge, right? Because then we can break a cycle. We need to have a number of years where we don't have children die of severe acute malnutrition. We need to stop it first, and then in parallel, keep working on all these side things. All the work that Heifer is doing, that Concern is doing, that Islamic Relief is doing on the development side. And then part of the development side on the nutrition part is things like these complements, we call them, these lipid-based nutrient supplements. There's new evidence that kids who are fortified, who have this every day for 6 to 12 months when they're little, there is a 30% reduction in incidence of acute malnutrition. So to have that extra boost and extra start in life, you're then starting to solve the problem of acute malnutrition, because we shouldn't be seeing that in the world anymore.
Thank you, Kirk. Jump in. I see
Well,
you
no,
want to.
there was just something that triggered
Yeah.
in me was one of the things that we haven't really talked about here today so far is this word conflict as well, and the role this is playing in a lot of these areas. And it's something that conflict is one of the leading drivers of a lot of what we're talking about today. And it's just something that we have to keep back in the back of mind as we're designing programs, so that we don't perpetuate or even make worse conflict, but that we also respond to it. And I don't think there's an easy answer to it. Don't get me wrong, but
Well, let's talk more about that. I mean, when we talk about these shocks, where despite all the development work we're talking about, which has to be ongoing and can help people prepare for disasters, but when disaster hits or conflict hits, where does innovation come in? And I can tell you, it's not just in the moment when conflict hits. It has to precede that. Do you want to go in?
Yeah, please,
Anwar?
if I can. So we know the importance of climate change. We know the intersectionality of that, green energy and land, all of that. We were doing that. I don't want to say which country, it was a particular country we're doing it in. Conflict happened a couple of years ago. The opposing side came, stole our hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of solar panels, took them. Probably don't even know how to operate them. Looted our warehouse. It took us 3 days to get out of there. Alhamdulillah, none of them died. They were able to make it out of there. I want people to realize that when we're talking about technology here, there are people risking their lives to implement this project. We lost one of our colleagues last month in Turkey in the earthquake. 20 of the family members of our staff died in Turkey last month. We buried over 13 people in the last 20 years. One of them was distributing food with WFP that's one of our main projects in Yemen. He was a driver, he was shot in the head. So I want people to realize that people are risking their lives from many different agencies to deliver this. And what we have to do is we just realize, okay, they stole our stuff. We're not going to go back with the food delivery. That's nice about innovation. This is not the time right now. We need to get food to these people. And once it becomes stable, we'll go back to sustainability. But to me, it's not a dichotomy. It's not that we either have to do cutting-edge technology or the old stuff. We have to do both. And I just wanted to add this about the money. In addition to what Kirk mentioned, one of the projects that's really important, we're doing it in Ethiopia and Pakistan. Many people can't use technology because they don't legally exist. They don't have an ID card. If you don't have an ID card in Pakistan, you can't get a SIM card. So before you give people a SIM card so they can get the money, you need an ID card. We're working on the ID cards, especially with vulnerable women who are widows. Through our widow and orphan project, we're doing that. We're making sure they have a birth certificate or trying to get one for them, then do that. Same thing in Ethiopia. We're trying to make these people legally exist. And we're trying to make these people financially, that they do exist before we can do all this cute stuff that we talk about, technology, things that we take for granted here. Many countries, you can't go and buy a SIM card unless you have an ID. So this is disempowering to many people. And as you mentioned, many countries were way ahead of us with the SIM card thing. They don't have internet, but they have mobile money.
I have a question for you. So you mentioned, there are the sexy technologies, like these game-changing technologies, but you have to do a lot of the unsexy work to make these work, like identity, right? And this brings up a topic I do hope we can cover a little bit here, which is the role of local organizations as well. So we're talking a lot about large international INGOs, and their work on humanitarian food assistance. And of course, large INGOs will continue to be critical to food assistance. But let's talk a little bit about local organizations and kind of connecting it to what Anwar was just saying. To ensure that innovations coming down the pipeline are actually going to be helpful in humanitarian food assistance, we have to do some of the unsexy work you talked about, like identifying people. What's the role of INGOs? What's the role of local organizations? And maybe who aren't we talking about? Like the private sector, for example? Yeah. Go ahead, Adesuwa.
Yeah, thank you. So I think that we have to be very careful to focus our attention on long-term sustainability. In 2015, the heads of governments got together and all agreed on the importance of addressing humanitarian issues from the point of prevention. In 2016, Ban Ki-moon also talked about the importance of prevention and driving sustainability. But where is the long-term gain? In Africa, we have the portion of the continent which we call the poverty belt. And the poverty belt is the driest and also the most war conflict-ridden part of the continent and the poorest. There is a close correlation between the perpetuation and sustainability of conflict and climate change, as well as issues of conflicts on the ground in terms of agriculture and land. There are issues, but the big one we never talk about is unemployment. In a continent with almost 70% of its population being young and available to continue to extend conflict without finding suitable jobs, these are critical issues that underline the issues of conflict that leads to what we try to deal with, and then losses of lives, like you talked about, where people are trying to provide protection in those kinds of places. And I've had the opportunity to work in those kinds of areas in northern Nigeria, so I know exactly what you're talking about. But I think the solutions are local. They are going to be driven by these young, unemployed people who need to be supported to become innovators, who need to be encouraged, who also need to become the solution. Why? Because they are closer to the problem and they can identify it. I think the solution is also private sector led, and we're talking about social entrepreneurship. All the ideas here today are driven by social entrepreneurship, but it has to be driven from a sustainable point of view. My own idea, where we are going away from grants towards products that people can pay a reasonable price for, no matter how poor we think they are. So I do think that thinking the long game and understanding these pieces is critical, even if it's a conflict-driven food challenge that we're referring to here.
Thank you, Maria.
No, absolutely. I love what you just said about using social enterprise and the market-based systems. The Plumpy Field network that we're a part of is all small and medium-sized businesses. They're food manufacturers in a dozen countries around the world. And some of this unsexy work that you're talking about, it's supply chain development, right? Yes, it's working with the local farmers. So like the partner Meds and Food for Kids in Haiti, they work with hundreds of Haitian farmers on peanut growing. The partner in Sudan, Samil, they work with thousands of farmers in Darfur on peanut farming. They then have a supply chain. So it's not just the peanuts, so they need to work on post-harvest storage. They need to have low aflatoxin levels. They need to have labs that can test these things. And then they have this supply chain that improves. We need more milk processing in the continent of Africa and other places. So it's funny, a lot of people call us and they want to start an RUTF factory, and I'm always like, how about have you thought about dairy processing or peanut or soy processing? Because all of these things are really critical in the supply chain and really part of the solution. And then these SMEs create hundreds of jobs themselves and then thousands of jobs when you take the supply chain into account, which starts to get more at the root cause.
So a final question for each of our panelists, and we just have a couple minutes left, so we'll have to be quick here. But I want you to look ahead to, it's hard to know with these technology and innovation conversations. Let's say 5 years from now. 5 years from now, think about, what does success look like? How will we be having a very different conversation 5 years from now than we're having now? What challenges stand in the way of getting to that success you hope for 5 years from now? And thinking through all that, what's one final message you want to leave this room with and our virtual audience when it comes to innovation and humanitarian food assistance? With that picture in your mind of where we could be if only something happened, what's a final message? Anwar?
Please, if you have invented something, do it open source. Don't just leave it with a corporation. We need to have access to the poorest people in the world. Universities around the world are great. They want access to your research. Please open source it.
Powerful message. Thank you. Adesuwa?
And I want to say to all of us in the development space and all of us in the space of investments and impact investments, let's begin to look at what is happening locally. I do 100% believe that the local people need to have cash, but I also believe the local innovators need to have financing. And I think that all of us have to allow our grants to work in a different way that builds a system that is there long after we leave and can have permanence on the ground and not just built around our programs or the work that we do ourselves.
Thank you, Adesuwa. Kirk?
I would encourage people to look beyond the low-hanging fruit in terms of environments. Like if I had $1 for every time someone said, "Oh, let's pilot this in Brazil," we could solve hunger probably. Like, how does this apply in the countries and the regions that it's needed most, and how can we push that?
Thank you. Maria?
earlier today, Oliver, with the Feeding Tomorrow film, said to everyone that businesses respond to consumers and politicians respond to constituents. That is very true. So my call to action would be to call your congressmen and women and senators and tell them that you care about international food assistance, both that comes from the US and that supports local and regional procurement. It's a Farm Bill year. Tell them you care and tell them you don't want to see any children dying of acute malnutrition anymore. We can reach 100%. And that makes a more stable world that then sets us up and the world up for development and health.
Thank you, Maria. Well, let's hope that these things happen and that in the next 5 years, it's a different conversation. I know there's a lot of work to be done, and thank you for all that you all are doing. Please join me in thanking our panelists.